Ethics and Legal Concerns Around the Internet of Things. And it's going to be by Priya Chetty, Regional Director at Encode. And just a reminder, you can tweet about the conference, put up your selfies and your thoughts about the conference or whatever, using the hashtag IoTFA on Twitter. Thank you. And as she prepares herself, just another announcement. We're going to have drinks and a little networking session after the event. So please stick around. It's sponsored by MTN. So immediately after the event, at about 3:15, we will have drinks right here in the venue. Thank you. Please.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It seems as if I've just heard that I'm between not only lunch and you, but also drinks this afternoon and you. And I have the privilege of speaking about legal and ethical issues. So I'm going to try and be brief. I'm going to try and be entertaining. And so please stay with me, and I hope it will be interesting. And of course, thank you very much to the organizers for having me here, and also for including this dimension to the conversation. I suppose it's a little departure from all of the exciting technical discussions that we've been having, but hopefully we'll stir some conversation and some debate. So when we think about the Internet of Things as lawyers and policy people, and I suppose there's a bit of a bio for me that's available, but basically I've been working for about 15 years on issues of emerging legal concern and policy concern, particularly for emerging economies, and particularly in the last couple of years for Africa. And when we consider technology, our first instinct is to get very excited. That's why we do it. I suppose that's why we're technology lawyers. We get excited about the minds of inventors and what's coming to our shores and all of the exciting innovation. But then we start to unravel what is constituted by the technology and the processes to try and understand what the impact might be on society and human rights and human interests. And we look at it from quite a different lens. So I have a few definitions that I've put up that have some bearing for lawyers when we think about the Internet of Things. The first is that the Internet lacks the ability to currently connect back to the real world in the way that machine-to-machine world as presented by the Internet of Things. The amount of new information that will be created will dwarf the amount of data that is currently being produced on the Internet. This is a quote from Tim O'Reilly, and he says, "This is really going to disrupt everything." And for me, this is probably the most important, which is that the Internet of Things is not just the Internet of Things. It's the Internet of behavior, and it's the Internet of life. And as you speak about sensors and the actuators and all the beautiful technology that you work with, that's what I see, that it's the presentation of behavioral data, presentation of details of people's lives. And that's the question that's before us. So what are some of the ethical concerns that people are thinking about? And this is some context even before we get into some of the legal discussions. The first is, if we imagine the world that we sit in and data protection and issues of control of data, we imagine the devices that we have in our hand, the devices we have access to. And we imagine the devices that are visible to us or known to us, at least. Now we're speaking about things that may be invisible. How do we subject this as lawyers, as people involved in governance and policy discussions, to inspection, quality control, and accountability? Ultimately, we want to know, who do we go to when someone's breached a legal parameter, and it's getting quite difficult. The second is, when we look at the repositories of information that will be created, we have an abundance of artifacts, not just the data that we're used to seeing, but little artifacts that are difficult to describe and place. So what will the criteria for identity be? When we as lawyers think about how we're going to protect personal data, we have certain definitions that we use. And currently, the definition that we use is information that identifies you. But when we have this abundance of artifacts that is related to a person's identity, but might not necessarily be identifiable, but might be a legal or ethical concern for them, how will we put that into a framework and monitor and govern that? Thirdly, will we lose human agency? And this is probably one of the most central questions from an ethical perspective. At the moment, we function with the assurance that we have this agency to control what it is that happens to our data, what we'd like to believe, or we have the ability to actually redress ills that we see. So to approach Google with the right to be forgotten, for instance. But what will happen when we have this multiplication of systems that is so difficult to get to with limited accountability? Will we lose the sense as human beings to have control as to not only what's happening to our data, but also what's happening to our lives? Imagine arriving for an interview for employment and someone has already read a report on you that you have no control over. Imagine, applying for an insurance quote and you get responses as to what your profile is, and you have no way to actually alter or amend that. Another one that's quite interesting is that people involved in the psychology element of this have been speaking about cognitive and social dependencies. So they're saying, if you think you have a dependency currently on your mobile phone or on social networking sites, imagine when your entire world is governed by the Internet of Things. The lack of internet will essentially handicap you. And how will you function? And what do we do in order to prevent that from happening? We're also going to see unpredictable emergent data. So if people like lawyers and policy people don't work on standards and issues of interoperability and so on, what we will get is unpredictable results. And we don't want that because it threatens even the innovation that we speak about. And then finally, just an issue to think about is how do we present accountability where there is this distribution of control amongst millions of systems, millions of processes. Then coming to some of the legal concerns, and I think I touched on this, the entire construct of how we currently govern privacy from a legal perspective is under threat. It all hinges, and it's a very unsophisticated framework if you actually think about it. We currently define identifiable information as the information we want to protect. We create a little commission. We ask them to ensure that everyone who processes identifiable information registers with them and notifies them of it. And that's how they supervise and have oversight over our privacy. How does that work in the Internet of Things? Firstly, we're moving away from personally identifiable information as that core construct of data that might be vulnerable. And secondly, are we going to get every player in the Internet of Things to register with this commission and subject itself to oversight by this commission and appear before it if they receive a complaint and submit its privacy policies and so on? The entire construct is under threat. What are some of the other issues? The other issues, for instance, is the issue of data repurposing. So our data means something in the context in which we receive it. And we refer to that as contextual integrity. And contextual integrity is important to the person who wants to receive the data and the person who wants to protect their data. I want to know that this information about my presentation is viewed in line with my intention to speak here today and not in another context. So what happens to that data when it gets repurposed by multiple persons in a context that I didn't imagine? And what are the implications of that? What about the rights that I currently have to mask and delete my data? Do I still have the right to be forgotten? And even if I did, how does that get administered and actually enforced? Imagine walking into a police station and claiming the right to be forgotten and asking for, many people along the chain of data transfers to forget about you. Then there's also the issue of cross-border regulation, obviously. I think we know about this. It's a standing legal issue. The challenge of existing accountability structures not being diverse enough and having the right amount of coverage. And then the proliferation. I think you're going to have a mild heart attack, some of you, when you see the amount of regulation that we found in international jurisdictions, regional areas, and in countries. And I even just took 3 African countries as examples to show you which legislation impacts the topic and regulates the topic. And it's not even a full set of the regulation that matters. What about personal data in a public space? Until now, we've been able to control that. So when you're in a public space, you don't have the same rights that you do as when you're in a private space. But imagine what's going to be happening in public spaces now. So does the current regime actually work? How do we bring transparency? So currently, the expectation is if you are running some level of behavioral profiling in a mall, you're supposed to disclose that when someone enters the mall. But imagine the amount of profiling and activity that will be going on. Imagine walking into the mall and receiving, I mean, how many notices will it be? There's a level of impracticality to it. And then, of course, a very practical, almost fundamental question, how does one opt out of the Internet of Things? Is that even possible? What about human rights? We're speaking about increased surveillance. We now know that in order for the government to know what you're doing and to conduct surveillance, they don't need to do it themselves. We now know that they just need to have the right to access the data of someone else who's been monitoring people. So imagine the data that is now available for prosecution, for evidence, and for government actors to draw on. What about your current personality rights? So the ability to control, you currently have a right to control your image, control how photos of you are used, how you're represented to people. How does that work when all of this information is distributed as we imagine? What about the freedom to associate? So the scenarios that are coming forward are, for instance, that I might be someone who would like to join a particular industry association, and I would submit an application, hopefully with integrous data about myself. But in the future, what we will see is that just by submitting my name and probably one identifying feature, this person will either reject or accept my application. What about the freedom to associate, to join clubs of our choices, and be with people that we choose to be with? And then, of course, there's huge room for discrimination and prejudice. We know that now. We currently, in the privacy laws, try to deal with that by saying that there's limitations on sensitive information. So if you've had political affiliations, if you have worked on intelligence reports in the past that an employer might want to get their hands on. So there's a lot of information that can be hidden and safeguarded. What happens in the future? So some interesting thoughts. There was an Internet of Things global expert group that sits together. They regularly have meetings. And this is the kind of governance framework that they propose. And if you Google this, you're going to find thousands of potential governance frameworks. I chose 2 that I think are useful. This is one of those. It sets out 4 points. 1, that industry should participate and implement appropriate safety and security requirements, and that essentially driving the impetus from industry to set the security standards. The second, that we have very effective internet governance platforms currently that are multi-stakeholder. If you're not part of your relevant chapter's Internet Governance Forum, please find it, get involved, attend. There's an annual meeting, and then there's an African Internet Governance Forum, and then there's the Global Internet Governance Forum. We need to be there, and even as industry, we need to participate in those discussions. The third, obviously, interoperability and standards should be fostered as a policy goal. And the fourth, policymakers and industry should also promote interoperable standards. So even from the other side, there should be that impetus. The New World Governance, an interesting group. They literally sit down and think about emerging new world issues. Everything from climate issues to, and this is what they had to say about a roadmap for IoT governance. We need a policy for IoT safety, security, and privacy. We need a legal framework, a model framework for determining appropriate behavior. There needs to be a focus on human rights and ethical behavior. And this is what I loved about this. It also included the dimension that nothing that we do from a governance perspective should threaten the sustainability of the Internet of Things. So it emphasized the benefits for society, not just from a trade perspective, but also in terms of the ability to print organs and all of that, and saying, don't kill this, this is good. So let's make sure that whatever we do is sustainable. And then this is probably very interesting. The big question then is, how do you introduce ethics to machines? So I don't know if we've solved that or if anyone can solve that. And from what I read, the closest that we have about speaking about ethics in the context of machines is going back to a 1942 science fiction writer that some of you might know of. And he wrote The Laws of Robotics. And this is currently the kind of thinking and philosophy that might drive how we apply ethics to the Internet of Things. And I mean, it's not rocket science. A robot may not injure a human being or allow a human being to come to harm. A robot must obey the orders given to it. A robot must protect its own existence as long as it doesn't conflict with the first or second laws. And then he also introduced at a later point this zero law, which governs everything, which is that robots should not harm humans. And that's it. And I think this has some utility. Maybe it's just me, but I think this kind of thinking can go a long way. I hope they're not laughing at me. So here's the scary part. This is for the lawyers in the room, people who have to go back and give regulatory advice and so on. I'm not going to go through this. This is the academic part of this. But it's in the slides just as references for you. It's the various international policy instruments, conventions, etc., that deal with the topic and the things that will be subject to change over time. If it's your job to note these things, monitor these developments, then these are for you. This is just the international. This is the African regional instruments. Probably the one to watch the most, it's the one that's very important on our agenda, is the Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection, the AU one. The reason it's important is because it hasn't come into force yet. So there's an opportunity right now to influence this, to make it good, and that's what we should try to do. Kenya, these are the laws that either describe Internet of Things or will be impacted by Internet of Things. Nigeria, Ghana. And then in South Africa, I went into a little more detail. And I want to get to just the listing. It's dying. There we go. So this is essentially the list of what we have to work with. So if presented with the question tomorrow, how do we introduce Internet of Things into our legal instruments? This is essentially the homework for me. So that's just a snapshot. And essentially, I just want to leave you with my kind of framing of what this means. There's certainly a harm to think about from an ethical and legal perspective. Internet of Things definitely brings added data, but it also brings technology-determined identities. So for me, it's not just that we're placing certain information at the disposal of people. It is that we are allowing machines to determine what is characteristic of us, what is an identity feature of us. That's what the machine can do. This increased availability and access to data increases the possibilities for data to be used for harm to the individual. But at the same time, burdensome legislation and policy decreases the innovation and sustainability for IoT. And so ultimately, the dilemma we have, because this is a current day issue, Internet of Things policy and legislation is no longer something that we can think about 10 years from now. It's today's issue. If we are to progress with this, what we need is global multi-stakeholder forums. We need the voices of everyone represented, from the business interests to the government interests, to civil society, to the lawyers, the policymakers, etc. And then what we need to work on is a balanced approach as well as a harmonized approach, so that every time I cross a border, I don't have to essentially go to a lawyer's office. Okay, maybe go to the lawyer's office, but you don't have to go to a lawyer's office and ask them for a rundown of how does my business work in this territory. So that's what we're hoping to influence. If you have any interest in this area, if you're doing any work that could benefit this, please do come speak to me, find me. I'm easy to find. And in case you're wondering what Encode means, I met Dylan on Monday, and that's the question he had for me. Encode is really about trying to code the kind of world that we would like to see through the legal and policy instruments, and particularly bring some positive impact in Africa. So that's what we're about, and look forward to meeting you and having conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya.